Sandra Bullock finished her sentence, and Jimmy Fallon set his index cards down on the desk and quietly stood up. The Tonight Show studio, usually filled with laughter and applause, fell into complete silence. For the first time in his 25-year career, Jimmy had stopped the show not for a commercial break, but for something far more profound. What Sandra had just shared wasn't in any script, wasn't planned by any producer, and definitely wasn't supposed to make a seasoned comedian freeze in the middle of a live taping. But that's exactly what happened on that Tuesday night in October, when a simple interview about Sandra's latest movie turned into one of the most powerful moments in late-night television history. What started as routine promotion became a masterclass in human compassion. And Jimmy Fallon proved that sometimes the greatest entertainment comes from simply being real. If you think you know what late-night television looks like, you're about to discover something completely different. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Earlier that evening, The Tonight Show was running its typical pre-show routine. Jimmy was backstage going through his notes with the production team, cracking jokes to ease the usual pre-taping nerves. Sandra Bullock was scheduled as the main guest promoting her new Netflix drama, a standard celebrity interview that should have lasted about 12 minutes, filled with movie clips, funny anecdotes, and the kind of witty banter that Jimmy was famous for. Sandra arrived at 30 Rock looking radiant as always, professionally styled and ready for what she expected to be a lighthearted conversation about her career. The Tonight Show team briefed her on the typical format: movie talk, maybe a funny childhood story, perhaps a game segment if time allowed. It was supposed to be easy, comfortable, promotional. But what nobody knew, not Jimmy, not the producers, not even Sandra herself, was that this particular interview was happening exactly 1 week after Sandra had returned from visiting her childhood best friend in hospice care. Her friend Maria, who had been battling stage 4 pancreatic cancer for 8 months, had specifically asked Sandra to promise her something during what they both knew would be their final conversation. "Promise me you'll keep telling people that every day matters," Maria had whispered. "Promise me you won't wait to tell people you love them." Sandra had made that promise, but she hadn't planned to share it publicly. She certainly hadn't planned to share it on national television. The interview began normally. Jimmy opened with his trademark enthusiasm. Sandra smiled and waved to the audience, and they dove into discussing her latest role. The conversation flowed effortlessly. Jimmy asking about her preparation for the dramatic scenes. Sandra sharing amusing moments from the set. The audience was engaged, laughing at all the right moments. But then Jimmy asked a question that seemed innocuous at the time. "What draws you to these more serious emotional roles as you've gotten older?" Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. Sandra paused, and something shifted in her expression. She looked down at her hands for a moment, and when she looked back up, her eyes were different, brighter, more vulnerable. "You know, Jimmy," she said slowly, "I just lost someone very dear to me last week, and she taught me something that I think I've been trying to express through these roles without even realizing it." The studio audience sensed the change immediately. The energy shifted from entertainment to something deeper, more intimate. Jimmy, always sensitive to his guests' emotional states, leaned forward slightly, giving Sandra his full attention. "She told me that we spend so much time preparing for our lives that we forget to actually live them. We postpone the difficult conversations. We postpone expressing love. We postpone forgiveness. We postpone everything that actually matters because we think we have infinite time." Sandra's voice began to waver slightly, but she continued. "And she made me promise her that I would stop postponing, that I would tell people I love them while they can still hear it, that I would have the difficult conversations while they still matter, that I would stop treating life like a dress rehearsal." The studio was completely silent now. Jimmy's usual animated gestures had stilled. His hands rested on his desk, his index cards forgotten. "She died 3 days later," Sandra whispered, and her last text to me was just 3 words. "Keep the promise." That's when it happened. Sandra's composure finally broke. Tears began streaming down her face, and she covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed by the weight of sharing something so personal, so raw, with millions of strangers. And that's when Jimmy Fallon did something that no host, no producer, no network executive would ever script or approve. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He set down his index cards, those carefully prepared questions that keep every late-night show on schedule and on track. He stood up from his desk, walked around to Sandra's chair, and without saying a word, he simply placed his hand on her shoulder. The cameras kept rolling, but Jimmy wasn't performing anymore. He wasn't hosting. He was just being human. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said quietly, his own voice thick with emotion. "And thank you for keeping that promise. Thank you for sharing Maria with us." The fact that Jimmy remembered her friend's name, that in the span of a few minutes, he had listened so intently that he internalized not just Sandra's story, but her friend's identity. That small detail broke something open in the studio. Sandra looked up at him, tears still flowing, and nodded. She would have loved that he remembered her name. Jimmy smiled, and for a moment, the audience saw something they rarely witness in polished late-night television. Genuine human connection. Not the crafted intimacy of celebrity interviews, but real vulnerability between two people who had just shared something profound. But Jimmy wasn't done. He turned to face the audience, most of whom were also visibly moved. "You know," he said, addressing the crowd directly, "Sandra just shared something with us that her friend Maria wanted the world to hear, and I think we should honor that. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming." Jimmy looked back at Sandra, then back at the audience. How many of you have someone in your life that you love, but haven't told them recently? Hands began to rise throughout the studio. Slowly at first, then more and more until nearly the entire audience had their hands in the air. "Sandra," Jimmy said, turning back to his guests, "would it be okay if we took a moment right now on live television for people to call someone they love?" Sandra, still emotional but smiling through her tears, nodded emphatically. Maria would absolutely love that. And so for the next 10 minutes, The Tonight Show became something unprecedented in television history. Jimmy invited audience members to take out their phones and call someone they loved. Right there, right then. The sound of dozens of conversations began to fill the studio. "Mom, I love you. Dad, I just wanted you to know. Grandma, I've been thinking about you." The show's band, led by Questlove, began playing a soft, improvised melody underneath the conversations. The cameras panned across the audience, capturing tears, smiles, and moments of pure human connection. Jimmy himself pulled out his phone and called his mother. On live television, millions of viewers heard him say, "Hi, Mom. I'm in the middle of the show, but I just wanted to tell you I love you. There's no particular reason. I love you." Sandra watched it all unfold, clutching a tissue, but smiling wider than she had all week. This wasn't what she had expected when she agreed to promote her movie, but it was exactly what Maria had hoped for when she made Sandra promise to keep talking about love and urgency and the preciousness of every single day. When the conversations began to wind down, Jimmy didn't return to his desk. Instead, he sat down in the chair next to Sandra's, the chair usually reserved for second guests. "Thank you," he said to her. "Not for the interview, but for the reminder, for keeping your promise to Maria." Sandra reached over and squeezed his hand. "Thank you for making it possible, for creating space for something real." Jimmy nodded, then turned to address the camera directly. "We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to share something with Sandra that I think Maria would want her to hear. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten." During the commercial break, something extraordinary happened backstage. Jimmy's assistant approached him with a piece of paper, a printout of an email that had just arrived at the show's general inbox. The email was from a nurse at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. She had been watching the show with a patient, an elderly man who was dying of the same cancer that had taken Maria. When he saw Sandra break down, when he witnessed the audience calling their loved ones, he had asked the nurse to help him write an email to the show. The email read, "Dear Mr. Fallon and Miss Bullock, I am 73 years old and I will likely die within the next few days. I have been too proud to tell my children how much I love them because I didn't want them to see me as weak. After watching your show tonight, I asked my nurse to call all 3 of my kids. They are driving here now from different states to be with me. Thank you for giving me the courage to stop being strong and start being loving. My name is Robert, and I wanted you to know that your friend Maria's message reached me just in time." When Jimmy read this email to Sandra on live television after the break, both of them were openly crying. But they weren't the only ones. Later reports would reveal that the show's social media accounts were flooded with similar stories. People calling us strange siblings, parents reaching out to children, friends reconnecting after years of silence. But perhaps the most powerful moment came at the very end of the show. As the credits began to roll, Jimmy did something he had never done before in nearly a decade of hosting The Tonight Show. He took off his tie. It was a simple gesture, but in the context of everything that had just happened, it was profound. The tie represented the formality, the professional distance, the carefully crafted persona that separates entertainers from their audience. By removing it, Jimmy was saying that some things matter more than show business. He handed the tie to Sandra. For Maria, he said simply. Sandra accepted it with both hands, holding it like the sacred object it had become. She would have said you're crazy for giving away a perfectly good tie. Sandra laughed through her tears, but she also would have loved you for it. Later, Sandra would reveal that she had that tie framed and hung in her home office with a small plaque beneath it that read, "Every day matters, Maria." But the story doesn't end there. In the weeks following that show, something unprecedented happened in late-night television. Jimmy began incorporating what he and his team privately called Maria moments into his shows, unscripted opportunities for genuine human connection. Sometimes it was as simple as asking a guest about someone who had influenced them. Sometimes it was creating space for audience members to share their stories. Always it was about honoring the lesson that Sandra and Maria had taught him. That authentic human connection is more powerful than any joke, any game, or any celebrity gossip. The Tonight Show's ratings actually increased following this shift. But more importantly, Jimmy had discovered something that would define the rest of his career. That his greatest strength as a host wasn't his ability to make people laugh, though he could certainly do that, but his ability to make people feel less alone. Years later, when asked about that night with Sandra, Jimmy would say, "Maria never got to meet me, but she changed my life. Through Sandra, she reminded me why we do this. Not for the entertainment industry, not for the network, not even for the ratings. We do this to connect with each other, to remind each other that we're all just humans trying to figure it out together." Sandra still keeps that tie in her office, and she still honors her promise to Maria. Every interview she gives, every public appearance she makes, she finds a way to remind people that time isn't infinite, that love shouldn't be postponed, that difficult conversations matter more than comfortable ones. And Jimmy, he never did go back to wearing ties quite the same way. Oh, he still wears them. The Tonight Show has standards after all. But colleagues say that before every show, he touches his tie and quietly says, "Every day matters." Because sometimes the most powerful entertainment isn't entertainment at all. Sometimes it's just truth shared between strangers who realize they're not strangers after all.